Good evening and welcome to TDM Talk Show. I'm your host, Kelsey Wilhelm. Our guest this evening is Carlos Lobo, a gaming law expert who was involved in the negotiation and drafting of Macau's gaming concession contracts some 20 years ago. With the end of the concessions drawing near, all eyes are on the retendering process, what could change, and what's happening behind the scenes. Thank you for being with us this evening.
Thank you for inviting me. It's good to be here.
It's great to have your experience and your know-how. You've been in Macau for such a long time and you've seen so many different interesting things happening. Obviously, the casino industry has completely reshaped what we knew Macau to be from 20 years ago. And a key part of that was Macau deciding to open up the casino gaming monopoly to other outsiders. And so can you explain to me that there was a whole concession process? I understand that you were involved as a legal advisor within that process.
Yes, well, I've been in Macau for almost 25 years now, and it has changed dramatically. Back in 2000, when I joined the Macau government, I was asked to start looking at the gaming laws that we had back then. And starting from that moment, I've tried to give an idea of what could be done at the time, and it was used essentially as a backdrop to the future changes that came in 2001. They started to look into the gaming industry, and they decided that the new law was necessary for Macau. And through that law, it was established that the monopoly was coming to an end, and they were going to open it up, and they would allow for 3 operators to run gaming operations in Macau. It was truly an amazing moment to realize that this is going to change.
Yeah.
Yes.
The whole world was watching. And one person who was definitely watching was the person who was about to lose the monopoly, who is the late Dr. Stanley Ho, who recently passed and was a very key part of Macau's entire gaming history, the godfather of gambling in Macau. I understand that you got to meet him on various occasions.
Yes, I met him only a couple of occasions. It was during the tender, the first tender, and although I didn't interact much with him, the fact that he was there was amazing because everybody was around him. He was the focus of everything. He commanded everyone. Where he would go, everybody would follow, be it journalists, be it even other members, all the members of his team. It was quite interesting to see how a person of that caliber would go inside the room and dominate the room. It was an amazing man, and
but I understand he was a little bit aloof from the individual, from the specifics of the negotiations, because obviously STDM wasn't going to have a monopoly anymore. SJM was then being put together to compete within all of this, and he wanted to have a stake within Macau's future casino industry. So from what I understand, he was involved with some of the higher level stuff, figuring out how much the companies might have to be contributing and things like that. But then he left some of the other things to Ambrose So, Dr. Hui Cunha for the nitty gritty.
Yes.
So were you in some of those negotiations also?
Yes. From the moment that we drafted the report that the chief executive then, Dr. Edmund Ho, signed off on, it was decided that SJM was going to be one of the concessionaires. Until then, Dr. Stanley Ho was there in some of the meetings where he did present most of the plans. The master plan of what was coming was presented by him. But then the negotiations came for the wording of the concession contract, and then he was not so much involved. I'm pretty sure that everybody would go back to him within the company and make sure that he was comfortable with it. But the negotiation itself was done mostly through Dr. Ambrose So, Dr. Hui Cunha, and to appoint also Mr. Louis Chiseng, which was an operational member of the team.
Now, there was an interesting time there because SJM and then obviously the subconcession MGM have a different scenario. They had to get their license, their tender renewed for another period to line up with the expiration of the other licenses. From what I understand, that's because SJM or STDM had casinos already open and ready to operate from the point they got their concession. And the other guys had gotten the concession. This was, it was Wynn and Galaxy, but then under Venetian's management?
Exactly.
Okay, that was an interesting scenario. So they ended up with a 20-year contract. SJM and then subsequently MGM ended up with an 18-year contract.
Yes.
We have this sub-concession scenario which came about later on. From what I understand, there's not an actual law which says that there should be a sub-concession. Can you just walk us through some of the steps that happen along the way?
The most important part here is that the law doesn't prohibit sub-concession.
Yes.
And that's one of the key aspects of this entire scenario. The concessions were granted to Galaxy in partnership with a management agreement with Venetian, to Wynn and to SJM. Because of SJM had roughly 11 casinos at the time, if I'm not mistaken, already operating. The government decided back then that they had a head start of operations, and it would take roughly up to 2 years around that for any other operator to come in and essentially prepare a temporary casino, which was called in the concession contracts. That they had that period of time, and it was necessary to adapt to the reality. And the reality was they are going to get 20 because that was the maximum that the law provided for, and still does, still provides that time frame. So SJM was granted only 18, and it was specifically because of that. Now, in regards Galaxy and Venetian, I can say that there are public statements in that regard by former Macau government officials, and it essentially explains that the relationship between Galaxy and Venetian, or Sands China today, was not the best, and there was a risk of essentially having to replace them or replace Galaxy. And that was not something that the Macau government wanted.
Company.
Exactly, it was KWA Construction, in fact, the Galaxy, the listed company in Hong Kong. So it was necessary to essentially adapt the reality of them having a concession and keeping the solution that was brought by the Tender Commission to the Chief Executive that said Galaxy won in part because they had the Venetian project. And the fact is, if there was another concession, another tender, the chances of Venetian winning they were quite high, which means that Galaxy would lose. But then it would create a not so comfortable situation. So the government essentially decided for a sub-concession. Granted, the law does not refer you can do sub-concessions, but it also didn't say you cannot do sub-concessions. So the government proceeded with that. And because, in part, there is a rule that each operator, the rule is that the government will treat the other operators fairly and equally. There was a claim that said that we have to give them also the other two, and it was decided to proceed that way. That was obviously a political decision. It was not so much a legal decision, but that's the way the government decided back then, and that's the reality that we live with since then.
And I mean, it's made many, many billions of dollars for all of the companies involved. But we did have the chief
But also
executive.
for the Macau government.
Yes, yes, specifically. I mean, we are probably one of the major beneficiaries of that, given the gaming tax. And we saw that throughout the COVID-19, well, continuing COVID-19. We do have the funds in order to be able to provide stimulus and ensure healthcare. So we can't say that it has been bad
Everybody
for
benefited
Macau.
from that.
Yeah, yeah. But then the chief executive did come out recently and he said that he wanted to get rid of the sub-concession idea, which from a legal standpoint does make sense. He said he didn't want to have sub-concessions anymore. But he didn't say that he wasn't open towards a 7th concession or a further concession. What you had said before that in the TDM Radio entrevista, you mentioned that during the consultation process for the initial 3 concessions, 3 would have been adequate at the time for Macau, given the conditions of Macau. And then that became 6 concessions within a very short period of time. And Macau was forced to undergo rapid growth, development, and change in order to keep up with the necessities of that. It also brought in lots of labor and also provided a lot of opportunities for many people. Do you think that the conditions in Macau now would be accepting or favorable, or a 7th concession would be favorable to the conditions of Macau now?
I think there's no specific reason for a 7th concession to exist. I think
Sun City and Chunmingham would beg to differ, and David Chow in the background as well.
No, well, probably. But why wouldn't they, for instance, compete for one of the concessions?
Yes.
There's no reason to have a 7th just for one of them. And the reasoning, if I'm not mistaken, was to have a concession that would be to help Macau government and to essentially operate on behalf of the Macau people. Well, that's what concessions do, in fact.
Yes, yes.
But going back to on one point, I believe the chief executive, Mr. Hao Zheng, has referred that he would not want sub-concessions, but he was also not referring to essentially scrapping 3 operators out of the table.
Yes.
I think there's an idea that we are going to adapt to the reality of Macau. And Macau's reality is 6. We have the size for 6. Macau has adapted in workforce, in population, in services to a point. There are things that are still lacking, unfortunately. But the fact is, Macau has adapted tremendously well now to this new reality. Going a step further to a 7th, why would Macau want that? What are the benefits there? Now, I don't see them, but it doesn't mean that there's no reason for it. People could come up with arguments that essentially explain why we should have them, why we should have that 7th. But at this moment, and with the information that I have, I just don't see it.
Well, I mean, we are facing increased competition regionally. We're the only real remaining project left to be finished on the Cotai Strip is the SJM's Grand Lisboa Palace. We've got the smaller project of Angela Long over there, but that's not necessarily something of the same scale. We do have expansion projects of Galaxy, expansions of Wynn, well, proposed expansions of Wynn. And we've got Lot 7 and 8, which have gone back into government, into the government's hands.
Yes.
But you're not necessarily of the opinion that Lot 7 and 8, even though they're positioned right in the heart of Cotai, should be used for an operator? Or are you in favor of it being used by an operator or for other purposes?
Given the location, and mind you, in fact, it's right in front of Macau Studio City. When you go to Macau Studio City, you can see right in front of it, and it's quite interesting to see it from that perspective. I believe it is ideally located for another property, another integrated resort. Who would have a claim for it? Well, any of the 6 operators could say, I want it. But also, it gives room for the government to make new decisions, and eventually, on a tender, on a competitive tender, why not keep it just in case there's a new player in town?
True.
that could come up with a new innovative idea, say, this is what I want to do. The government, if so, accepts and says, well, I really like that. Well, here's this line for you. Mm-hmm. You're going to have to pay for it, and you're going to have to pay all the premiums and everything that is required by law. But there's a line for that, mm-hmm. for gaming. And it's in the middle of the Cotai Strip. Yeah. So it makes perfect sense. It's just opposite Macau Studio City. Mm-hmm. It neighbors Sands Cotai Central, the mm-hmm. future Londoner. Mm-hmm. Its location is amazing for a new property. Mm-hmm. It would not make much sense, in my personal opinion, to do almost anything else with it.
Well, it's probably going to be public housing.
I would really hope not.
We'll see. So coming back to some of the things that have been happening recently, we've not only seen the passing of Dr. Stanley Ho, we've also seen Pansy Ho making adjustments because of the exit of the retirement of former CEO Grant Bowie from MGM. She's now stepped in as the managing director. They've got other team members that have shifted positions, CFO, COO, and there have been interesting theories as to what's going to happen, because we have Daisy Ho, who's in SJM. Is it Maisie with Shuntak? Pansy is with MGM, and Lawrence is with Melco.
All brothers from the same father and same mother.
Yes, and so there have been suggestions that closer towards the retendering process, Pansy might be making a move over to SJM, because by law, there's a law provision in which you cannot be a director of more than one company. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay, so there have been...
And you cannot have 5% or more of the shareholding
exactly.
of the company, of the other operator as well.
And so she's been selling down her shares as well. She did 2 tranches, I think, sold it down from like a 50% to a 20-something% stake, which seems interesting. It seems like, do you think that a possible move could be made?
The intent of the law, it's important to understand that the intent of the law was to maintain competition mm-hmm. between gaming operators. The entire section where those clauses are refer mostly to maintaining competition. Mm-hmm. Macau government does not want several operators being controlled by the same group. Yeah. A movement for consolidation within the Shuntak, TDM, SJM, and MGM mm-hmm. with Pansy Ho does make sense when you consider consolidation into one entity. Mm-hmm. That, for me, makes perfect sense.
But would that one entity include MGM? Or would MGM be kind of left behind?
It will make sense if Pansy Ho decides to move ahead and essentially take charge mm-hmm. of both entities. Mind you, that is not clear at this moment, mm-hmm. although I believe the relationship with her sister is quite close, mm-hmm. and I wouldn't say that they act in a block, but from an outsider's perspective, it kind of looks like that. Okay. So, in the sense that you would have one entity running both concessionaires, mm-hmm. it would make sense, but it means that one of them will lose the concession. Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Mm-hmm. What's going to happen? Well, it will depend on the tender, mm-hmm. and it will depend on how they move towards the tender. Because if they move at the same time, both SGM and MGM, then they have to be separate to at least to accommodate what's not only referred in the law, mm-hmm. but to the spirit of the law, mm-hmm. which is to maintain competition between operators. In this regard, I would not include Lawrence Ho in this group. Mind you, Lawrence Ho was the 6th operator obtaining the mm-hmm. concession. But if you look at his progression within the Macau gaming industry, from the Mocas to Altira to the COD, mm-hmm. he moved extremely quickly.
Oh yes, and his foresight with Japan as well.
And not only, he also has operations in Manila,
Cyprus,
and he had that. I believe he had
Tigre de Cristal up in Vladivostok.
in Vladivostok,
which
that's
Sun
correct.
City is now basically bought 50% of.
Exactly. Quite interesting, definitely. I would put Lawrence Ho very close. And mind you, let's not forget that he was able to get into that deal with Crown. So MGM is one of the giants of this industry for sure. But Crown is no small
Definitely.
part of the gaming industry. And he was able to get that as well. And from my understanding, he kind of did it, I wouldn't say alone, for sure, but he was the one that really led all the negotiations and maintained the relationship with them. And that shows to me that he's someone that moves very independently. So I would not put them all
in the same block. And that could mean healthy competition also.
Yes.
There is the current taxation that all of the various concession holders have to pay. Some have said it's high, some have said it's low. Do you think that there's any room for adjustment? Should there be adjustment in the new retendering process?
I think that taxation, although it's quite high, there is not a single gaming operator that wouldn't give almost anything to come to Macau.
Yeah.
I think the 35% tax is, although high, reasonable considering the revenue that Macau allows gaming operators to make. I think there is room is to discuss what we call the contributions that are established in the concession contracts, and they are for different reasons. Again, 3% for SGM and MGM, and 4% for the others. Mind you, some people might not be happy with reviewing this, especially considering...
Namely SJM.
Yes. But if it's to decrease for everyone, I think at least the gaming operators will be happy.
Yeah.
And the point goes to how are these funds, these 4% being used? And I think that's part of the discussion that Macau should have. Are we using it in the best way possible? Is a part of it being used in an optimized way, but others, there's room for improvement on other areas? Do we need Macau? Does Macau need that kind of revenue? I think there's room to discuss that. There's room for instance, for the government to say, okay, you're not going to give this contribution, but we have a level of investment commitment to invest into Macau higher than we had before, and well, there's room for discussion essentially to negotiate those percentages.
Well, and I'm sure that we're going to be having a lot of these opinions come up when they do launch the public consultation on this. Having seen the previous process, having seen how long it took to be able to get to people actually receiving their concessions, and the term that currently the casinos have until the contract ends, basically. We saw last time that STDM had to have their contract extended because they needed more time. The government needed more time to figure it all out. And understandably, this is not something you can do from one day to the next. This is a unique situation with a new government. They knew that they were going to have to be handling this change and this new retendering process, but then they kind of got socked in the teeth with COVID right within a month of being in office. Do you think that in any way delays what's going to be happening in terms of the retendering process?
I believe there is an impact. How strong that impact is, I'm not so sure. I do not have information in that area. But while I thought 9 months ago that Hoyatsang will have enough time to carry out everything, and have the tender and have a decision that is final after potential appeals to the court by 2022, now I'm not so sure. We have been dragged into this COVID-19 for 6 months. The ability of the government even to meet and to have interdepartmental meetings has been limited. How we are going to do a public consultation with all this, it's still a little bit confusing. It wouldn't surprise me if the government decides to postpone for a year the tender.
Okay.
Not the tender, but the time for the new operators.
Yes.
Or those that have regained the tender, the concession, and start the new concessions in 2023.
Okay.
I would not go beyond that because I think it just makes sense that the current chief executive makes a decision within
his first term. Assuming that he does get reelected.
Yes, but I think it makes perfect sense to do this within this time frame, and I think he will definitely push for that.
Okay.
And he still has time. There are limits to how people can appeal from government decisions under the concession, under the gaming law. But one thing is for sure. The time it takes to really review the entire documentation that is presented by gaming operators, the process of reviewing the suitability of every single person that it's within a proposal, it takes time.
Yeah.
And it's important to understand that. And again, as you referred, it was one of the reasons why the government back then postponed the term of the STDM concession, because it just needed time to do everything.
But do you think it's gotten easier this time around? I mean, back then it was kind of cut and dried. We have one monopoly and we're opening it up to 3 concessionaires. They can each make their bids and it's kind of a level playing field. Now, there is the possibility of another concessionaire coming in. These companies who are current concession holders have put billions and billions of dollars into Macau. I mean, some of the facilities cost $4 billion. Do you think that it's easier this time around, that the conditions that are being put forward in terms of, let's say, investment or obligations to the community, do you think it's easier for them to know what those obligations should be from the government side and also from the concessionaire side?
I think it will be very hard to understand everything that the government expects.
Yeah, that's true.
And to a point, what does the government want for a tender? And you will need time for the gaming companies to prepare for such a bid. Because it's not, again, for those 6, we're not probably talking about building a new property. We're talking about adapting to a new reality for what's coming next. So it's going to take time to adapt to that reality. Both the government and the gaming operators have a significant, difficult task ahead of them. That's for sure, and it's going to take time.
Oh, for sure. We'll have to see what happens. A couple quick things within the nuts and bolts of the contracts themselves. We do have a obligation for croupiers to be local only, and there's also a table cap. It's set at something like a 3% compound annual growth rate. So something around 6,600 tables, basically, by 2022. What's your opinion on both of those topics?
What I would say is that it made sense to a point that dealers were locals. It was an area that historically we always had Macau people participating in that. Nowadays, does it still make that? Is not that a limitation to the potential growth, personal growth of dealers? Do we need to have this limitation on having Macau residents in this area? I think it's quite complicated to answer that at this moment, but I think the government should really study this issue because there are pros and cons. mind you, I have family members that are in that area, and I know that it's not there's no easy answer for that.
Yeah.
But the government does have the opportunity here to decide what it wants to do, and to create a new solution. In regards to the 6,600 tables, I was not a fan of the decision to limit the number of tables. I think there could be other options that the government could use to limit potential growth. In my perspective, it created kind of a disadvantage in regards some operators that didn't have enough tables at the time that
Yeah.
decision came out.
True.
And that created a little bit of a problem for some of the operators, and I think it's not the best option or the best solution to limit growth. I think the government has other tools to do it, and I think that's one of the areas that they should consider scrapping.
Well, unfortunately, our time is drawn to a close. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens going forward, and I'm sure that we'll be speaking with you again soon. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for bringing me here. Thank you.
That's all for this evening. Join us again next week for more TDM Talk Show. Good night.